And hello everyone, it is Peter Sam, the Narrow Gauge Engine here, and yes, you read the title correctly, I am not done with the Railway series yet. Somehow. When I did my giant two-parter last year, I did notice something that I wanted to touch on again, and that is actually, Christopher Awdry isn't a bad writer, he's just weaker than his parental predecessor. He has some great stories, and while some do have flaws, what I saw from others were some great qualities that I enjoyed very much. So that's what this video will be focusing on today. I'm going to pull 7 stories from Chris's works and discuss them all one by one. 5 felt like too little for one video, and 10 felt like too much, so I went in the middle. If you enjoy this video, I can do part 2 in the near future, and do 7 more stories, and maybe you guys could give some input with the stories you'd like to see me defend. Anyway, let's jump straight in with the first story. What this story tackles extremely well is the representation of the main characters that make up the cast. This marks the true start of Gordon's progression into an older engine, as demonstrated by his general demeanour in this story. He acts so much like Toby, the old guy that just sits back and watches things unfold, unwilling to act unless the situation really calls for it. Whilst this is a reused character trope, it does provide the start of this great arc, so I am personally letting it slide. The way he interacts with specifically Thomas too is rather akin to some of the first volumes of this franchise. Speaking of Thomas, he is the protagonist of this tale along with Percy and Duck, and these are 3 of the biggest underdogs in the franchise. One of Thomas's most iconic quotes is, "Little engines can do big things." Percy faces adversity of all shapes and sizes, and I'd say far more than Thomas does. And Duck's major story that everyone knows him for in both book and TV format is when he faced off against a diesel, got shunned by his friends, got caught in a runaway, and yet the truth came out in the end. These guys coming together to tackle the Express is such a great plot, and it was a joy to see them defeat the difficulties in front of them. What's also neat is these 3 were the individual protagonists of the 3 previous stories that make up the book Really Useful Engines. Thomas had Stop Thief, Percy had Mind That Bike, and Duck had Fish. So this story really ties the book to a satisfying close in that sense, but these stories aren't just words on a page, it's illustration focused as well, and whilst yes, Clive Spong really needed to improve to be able to match the likes of Gunver and Peter Edwards before him, this story does have some of the best illustrations from this book, and I think he does fairly well considering it's his first outing. I'm not trying to argue that this one is a top 10 or even a top 50 story, I'm not with most of these to be fair. I just think these stories are the ones that deserve the most recognition, and I'm here to hopefully accomplish that today. Let's move on to story number 2. The charm from this story comes from how simple it really is. This one is just a conversation, and it works. Just like Scarlowy remembers before it, the main story from this one is told by one of the characters, whilst Edward just sits and listens. The character this time round is the vintage coach from the Furness Railway, Victoria. We get to know where she came from and what that line was like, almost stepping into an entirely new world. It does sort of feel like that when she begins monologuing. That part of the story itself, set around Lake Windermere, is very easy to become fascinated by, and a large part of that is due to the illustrations. Say what you will about any other of Spong's illustrations, but I think he produced some really strong ones here, and all I can say to him is fair play. The character we learn about through this story, Albert, is a bit similar to Thomas, something that Edward points out. And he is a bit cardboard, but let's be fair here, we're never going to see this guy again, and he is rather inconsequential to everything, so it matters less than it normally would. Nevertheless, design-wise, he is charming, so that's a plus. I'd say this is a very Railway series story, and what I mean by that is it's very in line with the franchise stylistically. We have 2 older characters discussing or reliving an experience based in real locations with real engines. It's one of those stories you just look at and go, yes, this is the Railway series, and I think Avalanche is pretty successful at making you do that. This story, whilst very low risk, does mean that we get some great entertainment value from it. What I mean by low risk is that it'd be very difficult to fuck it up, as it is a Gordon story where he gets his comeuppance. Those are very easy to make, as Gordon is a character with very obvious flaws that are at the forefront of his character, so this one was bound for success from the very beginning. The other characters present are great too, with Donald and Henry being secondary characters. These are both engines that are known to be very snarky and have high entertainment value too, so this boosts the value and comedic aspect of the story, which was already rather high. I think the thing that sticks out to most people as the clear highlight of why this one is so strong is due to the portrayal of the big blue bastard. He can't even get out of the starting blocks with the Express, which for an engine who's pulled it numerous times spanning decades, is quite the embarrassment. It's all to reinforce the idea that Gordon is getting older and his age is beginning to show. A great character transformation for him to undergo, and it's why this story is on the list. Yes, I know what some of you may be thinking, Why is it on the list? This is undoubtedly one of Chris's best stories. Well, this pick is more aimed at the Railway series fans that don't really acknowledge Chris's works and solely focus on Wilbur. And if any of you are watching, I highly encourage you to check this one out, as I'd say that despite the aesthetic shift, it definitely stands strong and could be argued to trump a fair few of Wilbert's stories. Okay, I have no clue what the consensus really is with this story, but I quite like it. It's one of those stories by Chris that seems like it could have very easily been adapted into a season's 5 or 6 episode based off its action. The obvious standout here is the collapsing of the bridge just being so fun to read. I find it well written, and the illustrations do it justice. Not only that, but once again, the characters interacting is rather enjoyable too. Henry and Percy interact at Knapford Station, and that scene is enjoyable. Also, Percy's driver is given this secondary role, and whilst his character doesn't really matter all that much, it does help to make Sodor feel like a real place with real people, even if it's just through the crew having speaking roles. It's nothing mind-blowing, but something largely ignored in the more modern eras of the show, namely the Brenner era. When has Thomas's driver ever spoken in that 5-season stretch? I can't think of a time. Then there's the little details to this one that just make me smile. Like the excavator rebuilding the bridge having a face. Is this the Railway series version of Oliver? All in all, it's just one of those simple stories that does things well, and is nice to reread. Out of all of these stories I've mentioned so far, I'd say this is the one that gets the bad rep, but I truly think it's quite strong because of the narrative twist brought in at the end, with Sir Handel thinking he's being ignored actually turning out to be that his fire bars are specially made and are taking forever to be delivered. This means that Sir Handel didn't have to confess to any of what he did earlier on in the story and just ratted himself out for no reason. That's fucking funny. As well as this, I feel that this is a story that handles the mention of real railway things well. Namely the fire bars. It's only mentioned when necessary and there's no big spiel about what they do or how they work or anything. It also gets me intrigued as to what they actually do, meaning that Chris is achieving the mission of incentivizing the audience to become interested in railways. And for anyone wondering, fire bars stop the coal from falling through the fire when burning. So all of that, on top of the perfect characterization of Sir Handel, makes this one of the strongest stories from Chris Awdry's tenure for me personally. Now, I reckon the entire book this story comes from, Thomas and the Railway Show, could be made into one of the best feature-length specials that the Thomas & Friends franchise has ever seen, whether it's made by Mattel or a fan. But this one in particular is great for its ending, and just the way it makes you feel all throughout. There's this deep sense of grandeur from the setting, and how Thomas is the true hero character of the story. It's a title he doesn't get often in the Railway series, with the obvious exceptions of stories like Thomas and the Breakdown Train, so it makes instances like these all the more special. Most of the time, he's an asshole, so it's great to see his more likeable side come out here as he spots the bent track. The other characters, as I've said previously, are great in this one too. I would have liked to have seen a bit more from them, but Mallard and Green Arrow stick out as the strongest and most prominent of the bunch. There's also the Fat Controller who appears at the end and congratulates Thomas, providing that sweet ending. But I think what this story accomplishes the best is that feeling of what it's like to be in the presence of a real steam engine. Fascinated crowds, rail tours, it's all there and it all feels so right. It captures that beauty so well, and I think that's why it deserves some recognition as one of the best of Chris's works. We're finishing this video off with one of the final stories to date, Gordon's Fire Service. This is an ending fit for Gordon, the clear standout protagonist of the Railway series with the most development. Even in this story, whilst he's clearly reached an elderly age, he's still learning new things like how electric engines operate. Speaking of, the electric engines that run the Peel-Godred branch, whilst not seen in any illustrations, do have prominence to the story as the antithesis to Gordon in a way, and helps to demonstrate the benefits of keeping steam engines around and how they can be helpful, or really useful, to keep in line with the vernacular of the show, in spite of how much more practical electric engines are. Gordon puts out a fire in quick time, stopping it from spreading and beating the fire brigade to the emergency. It really is that ending though that hits home for me. It makes me feel pride for Gordon at the knowledge that his arc is complete, having evolved from a snootier, prejudiced engine to a wiser and more experienced one like Edward. Truly a fantastic way to cap off this story, and it fills me with an intense amount of pride for him. And we've reached the end of another fantastic video here on the channel, and hopefully I've convinced some of you that one story or another from the selection I've chosen today is actually a great story instead of a dull one. I definitely have a few more of these stories I could talk about, so if you'd like to part 2 to this, please let me know, and I could always look at some of the overrated Wilbur Awdry stories too if that's something you'd like to see. As always, your comments and feedback are appreciated, but until next time, that's it from me. I've been Peter Sam, you've been you, and I'll see you again soon. Bye bye.